Discovering historic human remains in New Zealand are a fairly common occurrence. Here are two very recent examples. Normally though, in the case of the Wellington one, not in backyards. The human body is a fairly resilient thing after death. Once the soft tissue is broken down, we are left with the skeleton, bones of which can remain intact for centuries. Overall, most human bones located outside cemeteries or burial grounds tend to belong to pre-European Maori. Indeed, it is logical to conclude that all human remains pre-Captain Cook were those of Maori. Abel Tasman in 1642, having never stepped ashore, skirted the coast and shot off as quickly as poss due to a combination of bad weather, diminished food and angry natives. The first real European settlements in New Zealand didn't take place until the 1820s. The colony at that time was very much the Wild West, comprised mostly of men seeking their fortunes or passing through. Women and families were thin on the ground to start with. The first European women, technically English, known to have arrived in New Zealand were two escaped convicts from a penal colony known as New South Wales. That was 1806. The history books say it is unlikely for other European women to be living in New Zealand any earlier, and impossible in 1725. Only we now have evidence to say that was the case. You are looking at her skull. This mystery, one that is likely to remain so until either DNA testing improves or other physical corroborating evidence comes to hand, a breakthrough likely to be due to the efforts of the public, begins in a Wairarapa river, the Ruamahanga. It's 2004 and young local cocky Sam Coburn spotted something unusual poking out of the sandbanks after a recent flood. The skull in question. Fearing it was a victim of a drowning or something more nefarious, off he trotted to the local cop shop with Unearthing. One layman's look at the skull and the suspicious-looking hole in the cranium, they thought they had a murder on their hands, only they couldn't pin down the victim with any existing file. That line extinguished somewhat when the coroner got to examine it and concluded it wasn't a bullet hole. Most likely it was an old Maori grave that the creek had encroached on. It was then sent off to a couple of forensic pathologists for their summation, Dr. Rex Ferris and Dr. Kim Colwire. Tim is staring back at you currently. And yes, you're still alive, not on a slab. The two concluded, A, it was female, B, likely Caucasian, C, her death had occurred beyond living memory and couldn't be determined. Next up to cast his expert eye was Dr. Robin Watt, Wellington-based forensic anthropologist associated with Te Papa, the National Museum at the time. His conclusions were along the same lines, only he added her age was about 40 to 45 years. The good money on the mystery lady was still one that has died in the Wairarapa, probably by drowning, sometime between 1850 and 1950. Her burial spot having been outside the confines of a conventional cemetery. Radiocarbon dating would be needed to establish that age. Next stop, GNS, Geological Nuclear Sciences in Wellington, the home of the Rafter Radiocarbon Laboratory, the oldest continuous operating radiocarbon lab in the world. Their results were, to say the least, a bombshell. The science now said there had been a European woman running around the Wairarapa in the 1700s. Not 1800s or 1900s, 17s. A second test said the same. DNA testing could pinpoint the skull as being European, not what country. So what are the options here? The local iwi insist it must be a huayanga, a relative. It's not. Their position, to be kind, is rather unhelpful. Whenever an anachronistic item like this appears, a hoax is always on the table. Now ask yourself, Where does one acquire a skull of this age? And clearly outside New Zealand. You would have to go and illegally dig up a grave in Europe, and leave the jawbone and the rest of the remains, smuggle it back into the country past MPI and customs, place it in a riverbed on the off chance someone would stumble upon it. Even if you found that vaguely plausible, what would be the purpose? One skull doesn't make the case for an entire settlement of Europeans. If you wanted to fake that, you would need to come back with a customs form that included 20 kilos of assorted human remains plus assorted 3-century-old household implements, etc., etc. Now the science has been established. This is one of those cases where your and my speculation is worth the same as the experts, barring further evidence. Here's mine, which probably overlaps yours, starting with the location. When I first heard this one, I was asking myself the $10,000 question: how did she get there? Breaking this down into two chunks, the micro and the macro. Micro being the easiest to chew. Irrespective of how and when she arrived, how did she end up in the Wairarapa? That's about 50 k's from the nearest coast in hostile Indian country. What are the chances of a single middle-aged, by those times elderly, woman making it inland unaccompanied, not being killed and eaten, or integrated into the local iwi as a slave? Surely she had company. I can't imagine a single female being dropped off on Paraparaumu Beach simply because the crew was sick of incessant natter. Next up, the macro. Which country did she come from? Realistically, you only have three possibilities: Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese, the French and English being relative latecomers into the Pacific. The Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese having colonies in the likes of the Solomons, Macau, Malacca and the Philippines way back in the 1500s. Colonies being the important criteria here. Established colonies meant woman on board. Dr. Robin Watt's education guess is she was off a Dutch vessel blown way off course. This map is of the Dutch colonies in 1665. I've already done a video about the difficulties the Dutch had with navigation in the region at the time and how close they came to using the geographic name New Zealand up on Australia. I'll link to that below and at the end. My hard-earned money, the buying power of which is diminishing in value by the minute, says she was Spanish. They had colonies in Indonesia, Guam and the Philippines as mentioned. Spaniards also possessed a fleet of galleons loaded with silver travelling between the colonies of Mexico and the Philippines. In terms of sheer numbers of ships on the water in the region at the time, Spain was number one by a country mile. Moreover, we have a piece of solid iron evidence to give my presumption some impetus. The Spanish helmet fished out of Wellington Harbour in 1904, dated to 1580. As it happens, I've done a video on that mysterious object before, and I'll link that at the end as well. Like the skull, there has never been a proper examination how a distinctive object of this age, likely from Iberia, ended up at the bottom of Wellington Harbour. Kindly note before you watch my video on the Spanish helmet, the information on Te Papa's site has changed since it was produced. Stored away from the public at Te Papa, the museum is at pains to make it clear to anyone that cares.
Archival material in the museum shows so little is known about the helmet that it cannot be used as evidence of European contact with New Zealand before Tasman.
Not a dicky bird about the awkward business of European remains just over the Ruamatakas. That calls into doubt that statement. They are saying in essence no correspondence will be entered into. I'm not suggesting anything more than the possibility of an off-course, hitherto unknown vessel with either of the skull and the helmet, not a deliberate attempt at a settlement. Perhaps I'm drawing a long bow here, or simply more open-minded. You have a Spanish or European helmet dated 1580, dredged out of Wellington Harbour, and a European skull of a woman dated 150 years later, found 75 kilometres away. Another enigma to factor in. The ships at the time were tiny, and Tasman's carried just a crew of 55 per vessel. He had 2, by the way. Even if you were talking a passenger list that included female colonists, they wouldn't consist of any more than a dozen. In the case of a shipwreck in the era, where most people couldn't swim proficiently, if at all, what are the chances of a female passenger surviving versus a bunch of sailors? If you believe the shipwreck theory, the most likely scenario, I suggest you are with me in thinking she didn't make it to shore alone. I find this alone intriguing, worthy of further exploration, don't you? We also know the helmet, the one not on display at Te Papa, certainly wasn't female attire. What is on your screen now is a LiDAR map of the Buller River. LiDAR can expose what is below the surface, minus the shrubberies. It can also penetrate well below the surface depending on settings. Rather than running defence, what say Te Papa and the like engage a company or fellow government department with this technology, do a few pass-overs of the area around Featherston, see what is below the surface. They would be risking a rewrite of the country's history, but isn't that what they're there for? Finding a settlement of doomed, marooned Dutch or Spanish survivors would make global news. Our front pages, that would make a change. Engaging and intriguing, not earth-shattering and disturb the local hegemony. What would, though, is locating a European settlement, excavating it, finding out it existed for a generation or two. Perhaps the lady was born here. Her parents arrived here earlier. In all the read-ups I did, not one paid much attention to her age. Relative for the time, that would equate to about 65 in modern terms. Why would you take to sea with a 65-year-old? Currently, we'll probably never know that answer. Not because there isn't one, simply because there's no appetite to pursue the matter. That's why, despite its potential historic importance, this video will likely be the first most Kiwis have ever heard about the skull. When the story broke, over a decade ago, it appeared on page 3 or 4. The discovery was initially kept secret for 4 years after the Bombshell radiocarbon results. A sure way to fire conspiracy theories if there ever was one. I genuinely hope this video will reignite the public's attention to this matter and find an answer as to the riddle of the skull. Perhaps start the public looking for a wreck or settlement. Funnier things have happened lately. Clearly, the owner of the skull didn't arrive into Auckland Airport and carry on to Queenstown. Wellingtonians and locals in Greytown and Featherston, etc., taking this all in, start knocking on Wairarapa dairy farmers' doors armed with your metal detector you got off Trade Me. It is okay to start searching his paddock for extraneous metal artefacts. Scanning the coast with drones, looking for anomalies on the beach or off the coast. Write your name in archaeological history books. What's for sure in a conundrum like this?
We'll certainly never know more if we don't look.
Thanks for your time today. Do tell me what you think. Do your research on your own Todd and feel the fire in your belly grow. Don't forget to take a look at the other 2 related tie-in videos I've done. Send this video to your mates and rallies who may also find it interesting. After all, that's what this channel is all about. Poking and prodding. And now and again when I do that, I get a squeal of delight in the form of a subscriber. Bye for now.